with me now to shed light on emerging China internet trends resulting from the spread of coronavirus is Brendan Ahern, the Chief Investment Officer of KraneShares. Thanks for joining me today, Brendan.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right, so we know that companies like Alibaba, JD.com, already before coronavirus have just had these huge growth stories. So given the onset of coronavirus in China, how are these e-commerce companies in particular being impacted?
So surprisingly, they're actually doing well. The quarantine that China imposed, extending Chinese New Year, meant you spent more time at home in your apartment. So what did you do? You played more video games, you downloaded more videos, music, TV shows. You had to eat, so you ordered restaurant delivery. You need the food, water, toilet paper. You're using e-commerce companies and you're allowing your kids, they need to keep studying, so online education.
Yes, exactly. At IBD, we've been following the e-commerce companies in China very closely, as well as those education companies that you mentioned. So would you say that the coronavirus, obviously a very serious situation, but do you see it in the short term as a net positive for some of these companies in the internet space?
I think what you're going to see is habits are being formed, that the quarantine within China really forced people to use these companies, and in many cases for the very first time. So we think these habits that were formed during the quarantine stage in China, which we're really getting well beyond outside of Hubei province, are going to stick. I mean, that's something that the management of these companies have said repeatedly.
Okay, and in terms of the array of companies that fall under the China internet space, what else are you looking at other than e-commerce and education right now as being really key to that market?
I mean, for us, China healthcare is really an obvious one. That those names within China are outperforming the broader market in a pretty dramatic fashion. So we like healthcare, we like these internet e-commerce names, and then at the same time, I think there are areas you want to avoid. Obviously, travel, tourism, cruise ship lines, casinos, airlines. Mass events are going to come to an end, I think, here in the United States, just as we saw in China, and that hurts certain types of companies very specifically.
And whenever we do see this crisis pass, what do you think the impact will have on the long-term growth stories for, again, specifically players in e-commerce and education, which have already been standouts? Do you see the runway for growth still in the relatively early stages?
I think so. I think you're going to see a very dramatic fiscal and monetary response from the Chinese government. The Chinese government isn't lowering their 2020 GDP target. So that means the subsequent quarters are going to have to be really strong. And the China consumer, that domestic consumption story as it happens online, I think is going to see more and more support from policymakers and investors. We always want to align ourselves with those Chinese government policies.
Right. So you think the key takeaway here then is playing your spots within the China space, that there are some areas that are, in a way, benefiting and others that are not.
It's true. I mean, even in 2019, Chinese A shares went up about 35%. But if your definition of China was Hong Kong, say the Hang Seng Index only went up 13%. So a lot of what we do at KraneShares is we want very specific types of exposures. And I think that the coronavirus, the situation, really shows that, where you need to be very specific where you place those chips. And I think, as you've seen in China, where these e-commerce companies versus, say, travel industry, tourism related stocks, that's a massive delta. And I think for investors here in the US, you should be thinking about that as well.
All right, well, lots to think about in a time like this. Very evolving situation, so we're definitely going to keep an eye on those standouts. Thanks so much for being here today.
My pleasure.